All right, now that you know a little bit about everything that contributes to the results of a study, and you considered one indicator of scientific credibility, you can start thinking about what the results actually mean. The rest of the module will focus on quantitative studies because the nature of the qualitative study makes it a little easier to understand the results. The qualitative-quantitative debate you learned about in the first methods module also highlights the reasons we might question the credibility of a qualitative study. That said, to understand what the results of a quantitative study mean, we start by interpreting the results. When I put it that way, it seems a little too obvious, so it's important to note that it's not quite as simple as it sounds. I call it getting from results to information because the results are really just a collection of facts, so we need to think about how those facts come together. When you're reading an article, that's part of what the authors are doing in the first part of the discussion section. That could still be a few paragraphs though, and it's usually more helpful if we can think of the main idea in one sentence. I don't use Twitter, but I tend to think of it as being like writing a tweet that represents the findings. The related section of the analysis worksheet emphasizes that idea, summarizing the findings in a single sentence. Sometimes that can require focusing on one part of the study, and sometimes it needs to be more than one sentence. But thinking about it this way can help us focus right now. The first step will be to review the summary of results and start to think about what ideas are important given what we're interested in. We're working with articles about the ways to help reduce stress, so we can use that focus to think about what it's helpful to think about. In this article, the first hypothesis is most relevant to that because it's focused on the stress response. The second hypothesis also relates, but since it isn't supported, it's less helpful. So this is the part of the results I'm going to focus on. I could have highlighted it in my summary instead of transferring it to a new document too, but since I'm going to walk you through the process of thinking through the results, I thought this might be more helpful. Thinking about this information already helps me determine that the participants in the upright position had different feelings when they were stressed compared to the participants in the slumped position. If I were making notes in my summary instead of using a separate document, I'd probably highlight this information in the results section, and I might even add a note in the margin to remind myself that this is saying they have different feelings. Before I say more than they had different feelings, I need to remember that the design of the study influences what I can say. Remember, if the design is non-experimental, it isn't accurate to indicate that there's a cause and effect relationship. In this case, though, it is experimental. So I'm going to add that to the top of the notes about the results, or I'd highlight it in my summary. You might find it's helpful to actually add a note to remind yourself that that means it's okay to think about this as a cause and effect relationship. The last thing to keep in mind when we're interpreting the results is how the variables were defined, the operational definitions. Our notes about the operational definition of the variables help us remember that they had participants complete a stressful activity as part of the study. I added that to my notes about the article as a reminder that all participants had the same stressful experience. Then I looked for the information about the other variables. It took me a second to get oriented because they actually used the operational definition to describe them. Enthusiastic, excited, and strong were the feelings that represented a type of emotion on the affect evaluation index. More specifically, those feelings represented what's technically called high arousal positive emotions. I added that to my notes, so I have a reminder of what part of the stress response those adjectives were related to. Self-esteem and perceived threat were pretty straightforward, since the operational definitions use the same name for the variables. Since the self-esteem measure was really straightforward, I just added the name of the scale to remind me it was a self-report measure. The perceived threat measurement was the one where the participants read about hypothetical situations. I'd forgotten about that and was tempted to think they measured perceived threat relative to the stress activity in the study, so I made sure to add a note about the hypothetical situations as a reminder not to get confused about that. If I were making notes on my summary instead of using a separate file, I'd probably circle all participants so I remember that they all had the same stressful experience. Looking at what I highlighted about the affect valuation index, I might want to make sure I understand what the arousal part of the category label means, which usually takes me to Google. I actually ended up searching arousal, meaning, and psychology because I was a little worried about what I'd found if I just Googled arousal. One of the top citations or options for that search was from apa.org. And since I know that's the website for the American Psychological Association, I knew that'd be a credible source. It's actually an online version of the Dictionary of Psychology, which might be worth bookmarking. After I skimmed the definitions, I realized the second one was the best fit because it talks about emotion. So the labels for these categories are referring to the excitement or energy related to the emotion. So I might add a note to remind myself that the term arousal is referring to energy or excitement. Now that I've highlighted all the related information, I can start to think about what this means. I'll start by just thinking about the upright group. From this, I know that sitting upright when they were stressed seemed to help participants feel more enthusiastic and strong, which tended to be associated with energy or excitement. They also had higher self-esteem and were less likely to see other situations as threatening. Given that, I'd write a sentence like this to summarize those results. Were you beginning to think I forgot about the results for the slumped group? I couldn't figure out how to get it all in one slide that was readable, and then I didn't want to jump back and forth too much between finding the information and interpreting it. So, now the slumped group. The results only mentioned feelings, so I know to look at the affect valuation index because I'd already found the information for the feelings for the upright posture group. The results for the slump group were related to 3 subscales, though, where it was only 1 scale for the upright group. The fact that the results were related to 3 subscales compared to 1 suggests the upright group might have had a wider range of emotions, so I might add a note to remind myself about that. If I had it all on one page, I'd also connect the information about the meaning of arousal and the reminder that they compared slumped and upright. This indicates that participants who were in a slump position during a stressful event experienced several feelings, most of which were negative and associated with lower levels of energy and excitement. I could summarize that as a sentence like the second one in this slide. Did you notice I'm actually not following the directions? I have more than one sentence for this hypothesis. Thinking about the 2 groups separately can be a helpful starting point, but combining the information into one sentence can help us think about the fact that they were part of one study and one hypothesis. So far, my notes also treat the slumped group and the upright group almost as if they're in separate studies, which they're obviously not. But if I think about my notes about the hypothesis and what I've already written about the results, I know that the important idea is that the different posture caused a difference in how they responded to stress. So I start the new sentence with differences in posture during stressful experiences. Then I identify the 3 variables that were different when the groups were compared: feelings, self-esteem, and threat. The notes about the slump position didn't include self-esteem, but the upright group did, and that signals there was a difference between the groups. Finally, I added a phrase to indicate how, specifically, the feelings varied. That sentence brings together all of the important details in the other 2 sentences, so I can just use one in my notes. At the beginning of this video, I said we were going to think about the information represented by the findings. Now that I've walked through the thought process, we might summarize it like this. The information we can take away from the study is the result of the findings, but in combination with the design and the definition of the variables. Technically, it's probably not additive like the summary in the slide would suggest, but instead it's more the way the 3 work together when they're combined. But I have a feeling you get the idea from this explanation, so this shorthand can be a quick memory prompt.